Hi. Thank you so much for this amazing introduction. I'm going to have the speaker slide now. Can you hear me well? Yeah? Well, thank you so much for inviting me to Cooper Union. I'm very honored to speak in this lecture series, and also honored to speak at this place, which is so deeply connected to what I am going to talk about. So the talk is on post-Black art, but two alumni of Cooper Union who play a role not necessarily in post-Black art, but in Black art in New York, Augusta Savage and Roy de Cavara, who actually studied here. So it's an honor to be here. Post-Black art, I want to start with a question. How many of you were born between 89 and 94? Okay, and how many of you who were born between these dates know about the post-Black art discourse or have heard about it a little bit? Awesome. So this is exactly why this is post-Black, because this first post in the title of this talk is the temporal post. Oh, let me start to time myself. Otherwise, this research that started 8 years ago will take over and I speak for hours. And then you will fall asleep eventually. So the first post is the temporal post, meaning after. The second post in post-Black is the more complicated one that this talk is actually about. But before I begin, I want to make one thing very clear, that I am not going to talk about post-race. We can discuss this afterwards, but this talk has nothing to do with that. With post-race, why post-race and post-Black are often thrown into the same pot has also its historical background, but that's not what I'm going to do. Let me rather start with the place that is intrinsically connected now with the term post-Black, which is the Studio Museum in Harlem, upstate. And one of the major arguments that I want to do today, so today I'm going to really predominantly talk about institutional politics and the connections between social-political changes in the United States and how that has affected the arts and vice versa. But the Studio Museum actually was founded, or its opening was in 1968. And here you see a picture from the opening night where the Studio Museum was still located on 2030 or 2033 on Fifth Avenue in Harlem. There's something very interesting to the founding moment of this museum, or how this museum came about, because it came actually out of the Harlem riots. The Harlem riots that took actually place in 1964. And they took place because of the violent killing by a police officer of a young Black person called James Powell. So James Powell got killed. That's 1964. There are plenty of initiatives that would then, by the municipality, by the state of New York, etc., that would try to understand this very important moment in U.S. history and in Black history. So we're also in the midst of the civil rights movement, you have to imagine. And Kenneth B. Clark and Mommy Clark, who were so instrumental in the decision Brown versus Board of Education, were then called upon, actually already earlier in 1962, to create a youth program to work against the urban crisis. An urban crisis in Harlem and Bed-Stuy that actually was caused by systemic racism, as we know today, as we actually know many of those facts already. However, in 1964, an initiative started to create or to further fund this program. And so young people from Harlem would travel to the MoMA in order to, and they were called, culturally deprived. So culturally deprived young people would travel to the MoMA, and then they had this idea, oh, why don't we create an art center in Harlem for the Harlem youth so that they don't have to travel all the way down, and also it would be good to have a museum for African American art uptown. And this was actually the decision that led to the Studio Museum Harlem to come into being. So what is the connection here? The connection is that we have a social uprising, we have the results of systemic racism that then lead to the introduction of a cultural institution that is so, let's say, central to the discourse on African American art today. And this research, if you're interested, there's a fantastic publication called Mounting Frustration by Susan Cahan, who is actually looking at institutional politics in particularly this time period and how major museums have failed, particularly minority artists and communities, to create basically a place where the museum is one of equity instead of still segregation. And Susan Cahan, talks very distinctly about a two-tiered system that we're experiencing here today, which is, on the one hand, you have the specialized, the specific museum and art institutions, and then you have the kind of mainstream ones. And what is interesting there, in terms of mainstream, or let's say hegemonic, dominant ones, is that you have the single or the solo exhibition of African American artists as a form of inclusion and special focus, etc., but not necessarily a change of the general canon or the way how art is collected. That is actually also changing, but I would say not fast enough. So all of that to say is like the history in which we have to think about post-Black art, because without the Studio Museum Harlem, it would not exist in the way how it does. Also, very important, this kind of two-tiered system is now actually will continue. We have now in 2021, the Studio Museum is going to expand. There's this new building that is planned. So that kind of dichotomy, between the culturally specific and then the, let's call it, universal art discourse will be perpetuated. And that is one of the tricky questions that I have not an answer to yet. But let me talk about the minds behind post-Black art. So Thelma Golden became, in 2000, and this is actually a picture of her in 2000, became the new appointed studio museum director, and her and Glenn Ligon, a friend of hers and important American painter, coined the term post-Black. I will go into that and what post-Black means in a second, or how they defined that. I want to, again, make a little bit of a historical detour before I can come to where they actually ended. So let's talk about Thelma Golden, who I'm pretty sure you may all know. She was, interestingly, when I actually, to be very honest, she was the one who put me onto this journey on which I am still on. When she gave a talk at the Tate Britain in 2009, where she was actually talking about post-Black art, or it was 2008, something in between. I was in London doing my master's degree, and one of the things that I overheard at the time, but that really was very distinctive for her career, I think, was her desire as an art student, an art history major, to learn about African American art. which was not possible for her because there was no such acknowledgement as like let's not call it genre, but that there were African American artists worth to be researched. So she was having that desire for a discourse. She was interning. She was an intern at the Studio Museum before she became then an assistant curator at the Whitney Museum, where she was involved in 1993 in the Whitney biennial. And now 1993 is again a very important time in the U.S. history. So we have in 1993, we are 2 years after the first Gulf invasion. 1993 is also the year when the Rodney King beating took place, right? Like we have the LA riots. So again, we have police aggression against a black person that then leads to an uproar and I wouldn't call it change political consciousness, but I think just like the frustration was becoming much clearer. We're also 2 years after Judith Butler published Gender Trouble, 1991, what else? Which president was it? Was it the first Bush or are we with Clinton already? First Bush or Clinton? History lesson here. Okay, I'm not having that quite clear right now. But one in between, you know, it's like whatever. But important, if it's Clinton, then we have Maya Angelou at the inauguration giving her poem and all those promises. It's the moment of multiculturalism. It's the moment where postmodernism, identity politics come to the forefront, which is why this one, of course, like this was reflected in contemporary American art at the time. And that's why it was called the political one. And actually many critics would not be too pleased with what they would be encountered with, which of course is also part of like who is part of the art establishment. So if you would get an admission button by Daniel Martinez that says, I can't imagine ever to be white, and you walk around with that in the museum as a white person, you may feel quite uncomfortable or offended or, you know, or you come into the museum and you see Padward Williams, what you're looking at. So from 1992, so that's a reversed gaze. It's black and brown youth who would be criminalized in the public eye are now hanging in this kind of well-established museum, throwing the gaze back and calling the person out for who knows what, right? So this is one of the shows that Thelma Golden was involved in. And just a year later, and again, like Rodney King and the LA riots took place in 1993, and in 1994 we have the Black Male show at the Whitney Museum, which is extremely important, and it's very important in the sense that you have the intersection of gender and race discussed in the U.S. American discourse, which hasn't happened in that way before, you know. So there was maybe a little scandal, not a little, but a scandal around Robert Mapplethorpe showing black penises in a museum, but it would not be that you have black artists, actually like a plethora of artists, not just black artists, looking at that very, very intersectional history in the U.S. discourse. But I also want to draw attention, that's why I have the catalog here, which was edited by Hilton Als, which is also something that, for me, shows you the exchange between the black diaspora, because Kobina Mercer and Isaac Julian are very important for the UK discourse and for the black arts movement in the UK. So the artists that were assembled here, the theorists that were assembled in this show, were in a let's say, cross-Atlantic discourse. Stuart Hall is a person who was very important in the UK. The UK would also experience its multicultural moment, and you have another institution coming into being, which is INIVA, that still exists but not in its same condition today. So it's a very important moment for the Black diaspora. I have to emphasize these exchanges because Black arts in the US does not exist in a continuum, and I think that's very important. As a Black European person, I have to point that out. So here you would come in and see Fred Wilson's signature piece, Guarded View, from 1991, which is now kind of like 101 related to this show. So these were the predecessors. Now we're in 2001. 2001 was the year I did my research when the Backstreet Boys were singing the national anthem at Super Bowl. It was not Beyonce. If the Backstreet Boys don't say anything to you, just watch the video online. It's absolutely hilarious. So that was in 2001. Also, 2001 was when 9/11 happened. We have we're in the midst of the Bush administration, another Bush administration, and it's also, but the freestyle, the first show that coined post-Black art, happened before 9/11. So whatever was shown in that show was not affected by these events. So what did post-Black art actually mean? It meant for Ligon and Golden, post-Black was a description of artists who were adamant about not being labeled as Black artists, though their work was steeped, in fact, deeply interested in redefining complex notions of Blackness. Okay, that is a little bit vague. Who thinks that's vague? Yeah, it is very vague. It's like, it's this kind of classical sort of, okay, well, I'm actually, I want to be taken serious for my work, and I don't want to be put into the framework of Blackness in a way. But at the same time, my work is about Blackness. So this is like exactly the dichotomy that you would, that we can encounter in not just, I think, Black arts, but it's the problem of you have this category. So in order to talk about this category, you have to name the category, right? And once you named that category, you also brought it into being. And that is the philosophical kind of aporia, yeah, like an unresolvable philosophical problem. On the other hand, there is race as a floating signifier, as Stuart Hall would call race. And you have the reality of Blackness, you have the lived experience of Blackness. So all of these kind of dichotomies and antagonisms that come with the term are all embedded in post-Blackness. But we have to make a really, really big distinction between the discourse around post-Black and the discourse around post-Black art. And that was something that I had to consistently come back to, because after the term was in the ether, it literally was everywhere. So we have freestyle in 2001, frequency in 2006, flow in 2008, and four in 2013. These were the so-called F shows at the Studio Museum. And what is very interesting, in 2001, the term post-Black was dropped, which was then still taken on in 2006, but with 2008, what happened in 2008? Yes, so we're in a very different, like, political moment now in the US, a historic moment, and Flow was actually the exhibition that opened up the discourse to a wider diaspora approach, and also invited African or artists who were either born in on the African continent or born to African identifying parents in the US, would also be included in this show, and that would then be called Afropolitan, because they couldn't be necessarily post-Black. That's like, again, another issue that I also talked about in one of my articles. So we have flow, and then we have four. And four in 2013 was very, like if you go through the catalog, there's no mentioning of post-black anymore. And it's now just a survey of bringing talented African-American artists together in order to showcase their work. So it's like not a thematic framing anymore, it's not post-black anymore, and nevertheless it's part of the F show. So we have also here a big contradiction. However, it would not, that's my argument, it would not have been possible to talk about post-blackness in 2013, 1 year after the shooting of Trayvon Martin. Yeah, who would talk about post-blackness today, or who would like, not, I'm talking about it, but I would not go on the street and protest for post-blackness, right? Like it's a very different historical moment, sorry. But here are the artists from 2001. It's like I felt very jolly when I saw this picture because it really made evident how long this is ago in terms of the styles. It's very retro. If you want some early 2000 style advice, go to the pictures of these artists who were involved. Here you see the two installations, one by Cory Newkirk and one by Kojo Griffin. And here, already in 2001, you see in Cory Newkirk's All Over a critique of actually systemic racism with his pomade painting on the wall called All Over. So the theme of police and state violence is not actually something new in the works by black artists, but it actually, there is a resurgence in that in the contemporary, which is of course due to the historical circumstances. So I framed this as hopeful but critical because it was a very different moment to the following shows. Here you see the catalog and a close-up of the catalog. So again, the desire to have an art historical discourse comes here very much to play, or is at play, because every artist would be paired with a writer that would be invested in contemporary black art. So you have the nurturing on the one hand of artists, but also of critics and people who would be invested in researching contemporary black art. Courtney J. Martin made a fantastic observation when it comes to the first exhibition. She said, who's an art historian, on reflection, the two terms make apparent, freestyle, that what was being offered was less a style than a generational moniker, because each term rests upon the distinction of race. Of course, race cannot be unproblematically construed as a style. So one of the misunderstandings with freestyle, with the first show, was like post-black art is an aesthetic stance. It's a completely new and completely different style. It is not. It was actually a very, very smart way to draw attention to black artists who were predominantly overlooked in the art field. Most of the artists, and it was actually a 50-50, 50% women or female identifying and 50% male identifying people who were part of that show, which is also often overlooked. And most of them actually had master's degrees or were in very prestigious programs before, but were not in any major collections, for instance. So Martin argues further, although what the show did and what viewers and critics saw were not always perfectly matched, one note of connection was that what was being viewed as a style was actually the newfound awareness that black artists existed in the contemporary realm. The style in question was one of visibility. Yeah, so that is one of the major contributions of this show. But there is also an interesting shift that one has to take into consideration that Dawood Bey, a photographer, wrote about. When he said that there was like a very particular idea about black artists in the 1990s and the way how identity politics played into that did not make it possible for shows to have, for instance, abstract expressionists as part of like a conversation around identity. And on the other hand, you wouldn't see an abstract expressionist show with an artist such as Norman Lewis, who was one of the founding members of that group. Yeah, so that kind of exclusion existed also throughout the 1990s. And here again, I just want to briefly show you someone who would be included in shows, someone like Lyle Ashton Harris. I foreclose what Dawood Bey already said. Again, Isaac Julian, Rotimi Fani Kayode would be shown. You have works by Lorna Simpson, all very like photography, very figurative. I mean, revolutionary at its time. Marlon Riggs' Tongues Untied. I mean, I call it today an art piece. You can like put it into definitely into a major show. But this was one of the first films that was shot, or documentaries that was focused on the specific experience of black gay men. And here we have the collaboration between Ike Ude and Lyle Ashton Harris. So one of the arguments that was later made on post-black art was that it was queer, and that is Derek Conrad Murray. And his argument says that post-black became a powerful means to construct an identity of blackness that was more inclusive of those who were queerly identified. It was not a post-racial stance, as it is often mischaracterized, but rather a means to visually construct a notion of black identity that resisted heteropatriarchal values. Now, if I go back to the pieces that I just showed you, then we have to kind of correct that statement, I would say, even though it's a very important contribution to the discourse, Conrad Murray's work. What he is basically trying to do in this book is to say that post-black art is a big distinction to the black arts movement. So the black arts movement, his argument was predominantly heteropatriarchal dominated. There was like a lot of misogyny. There was a lot of gay phobia, homophobia, transphobia, and a very particular idea about what it meant to be black. And it was definitely not queer. Unfortunately, he's not so much talking about gender queerness, but proposes that the first show, Freestyle, opened up the gateway for queer identifying artists in the African American kind of established art scene. So this is this argument. We have another author, Margot Natalie Crawford, who just published Black Post-Blackness, who's talking about, also about the Black arts movement, but she says, as the Black arts movement became the first cultural movement determined to make art that is specifically and unapologetically black, the artist's search for the specificity of black art led to a wide horizon of shaping and unshaping blackness that I call post-blackness. Okay, it's very complicated, obviously. But what she's trying to argue is that in order, so again, I'm talking about the category, right? Like I always have to go into philosophy in order to actually make sense of this discourse. But she's talking about the Black arts movement as like trying to define blackness. And in order to define blackness, she argues, you have to step out of it in order to be able to even think about it, right? It's like a little bit like imagining the double bind by Du Bois, and you're stepping out of the double conscious, or you having the double consciousness is already the moment where you're stepping out of the frame, and then that becomes post in Natalie Crawford's discourse. The other discourse that happened, please let me know if I'm too fast or if you have questions, okay? Because I'm running through this. I've talked to myself about this 100 times, so I know. The other discourse that took place with the Obama administration and took off and was not very helpful for the arts, I argue, was Touré's book, Who's Afraid of Post-Blackness, from 2011. And I mean, this book has its place, and the trouble with post-blackness is then kind of a reaction to Touré's work. However, Touré's work is taking the discourse outside of the arts, and it's more talking about identity politics. And basically, it's a little bit like, it's a very neoliberal attempt to say, you know, you just got to work hard, and then you can, it's like driven by this kind of racial uplift narrative still, and he's only talking to established personae in Black America. And please read it, it's important, it's an important historical document. However, this has nothing to do with what was happening in the arts or discussion around styles or anything. So, and I think that is very interesting because so easily these discourses taken as soon as you have like an identity label are taken into a completely different conversation. So let me return to the arts after this little survey into what the discourses were about. Romare Burden in 1974 said something that I'm still thinking about, and that I think is very, very, very important for the way how we look at art, how we perceive art, how we make art. He says, I believe in the aesthetics that informs the artworks of Black people, since aesthetic formulations derive from cultural responses and not from inherent racial endowments. And I think that is one of the most important statements you can make. However, is like how do we unpack that without becoming essentialist? Again, yeah, how to think about, or how to learn about art, or how to look at your own artwork without thinking about your experience and your position and being in the world, really. And I think that is the tricky point that this research has consistently pushed me to think about, and also in my teaching. So let me talk about the artists that I was interested in, just very briefly, and to give you a little bit of a background that again is connected to what we're talking about today in the Afro-pessimist and Black nihilist conversation. I have to start with actually Glenn Ligon again, who would not be called a post-Black artist because he was definitely not born after the civil rights movement. However, his piece, I Am a Man, from 1988, which was inspired by the civil rights movement's posters, I Am a Man, was an inspiration for Hank Willis Thomas, who would then later on create a piece on that basis. But what is in that poster is, of course, and I didn't bring an image of that, unfortunately, is the little abolitionist image that you may all know, Am I Not a Man and a Brother? So to claim I am a man, I am a human, goes at the heart of what is in part of the Afro-pessimist discourse today. So you have the commodification, you have the dehumanization of human beings, right? You take away their, or you think you take away their ontology, so that you have in 1968 protests that have to claim that very humanity. And so Glenn Ligon asked this question in 1988. We are at the height of the HIV/AIDS crisis in New York, which is very important. Reagan is president at the time. I mean, I don't really know when the times here are not oppressive for Black people, to be honest, by now. But Hank Willis Thomas riffs of this painting and this historical moment by deconstructing it to a point where it actually looks like a Dada Dada poem. Okay, so it's like going into the absurd, like deconstructing even the political, the historical moment to a point where it actually becomes a cry into or call into nothingness, really. So he said, can you read this? Yeah? Okay. So this was one of, I can only like give you little insights into the different art pieces because I'm already very far into the time. Do you have questions about this one? No? Or maybe later. Another artist who would later be part of the post-Black art series was, what's her first name? Yadom Boache. Ghanaian. Lynette, thank you. Oh, thank you. So Lynette Yadom Boache. I have a quote by her, and we'll also show you her work. But again, when we go back to Romare Burden's idea of Black aesthetics, then I think this makes great sense when she says, more recently there's this question, why is everyone Black in your paintings? And she says the very simple answer is, well, what else would they be? Black isn't other, it isn't an odd detail. Yeah, so it's like this shifting of like, what is the center? How to depict reality that is off-center, that is not like white, Eurocentric and dominant, yeah, and normalized. And here you see another picture or painting of hers. And I think in this quote is in particular interesting to me because these are not real people. Okwe Nweza called her work para-portraiture because it's actually these are made-up figures that are coming from her fantasy and they nevertheless are all Black. I will jump through this one very quickly and very important. And if you are studying art, or actually whatever you are studying or whatever you're interested in, I really want to recommend you to look at this piece because Hank Willis Thomas' Reflections in Black Corporate America from 1968 till 2008 is a fantastic piece that shows you how Black identity was going through advertisement and resold to the Black communities, and how much of what in the US is thought of as African American identity is actually also produced again through the capitalist system. So what Hank Willis Thomas did was he collected all these magazines and then erased the language, very like Roland-Barthes, like punctum and studium. He takes the language away, and then what remains is just the image. And these just images are actually very, very telling in the sense of how the hairstyle changed, but also what kind of stereotypes were existing about Black people. I have to... Okay, let me talk about... Yeah, okay. Let me talk about this one very briefly by Mickalene Thomas, who was also part of she was part of the second of Frequency. And here in Le Déjeuner sur l'herbe, you see how Mickalene Thomas works with appropriation, but she is not. I mean, she is in discourse about Black identity, but what I think is very what is dominant in her work is let me find my words, is an inquiry into the art historical established canon. Okay, so she's in a constant conversation with the old masters. The old master here is nobody else than Edouard Manet, the founder of or who's now called like the founder of modern painting, modern art, and of course here the very important fact that the woman, the naked woman, is looking at us. And that was actually at the time when Manet was painting this Le Déjeuner sur l'herbe, was the scandal, which then pushed the painting to the Salon des Refusés, the exhibition of the refused in Paris, and people were writing caricatures in newspapers, etc. So this is the scandal piece, and she replaced all of the protagonists in this piece with black women, apart from the woman in the back who is taking a bath. That is actually a sculpture by Rodin. But what is important here, next to the reference to blaxploitation, is that you also have the relationship to black women and how they were portrayed in classical painting by Manet. And I have here Manet's Olympia, who is served by a black woman who, as we know today, was called Laure. And Laure is here, down here, you see her, was again like painted by Manet, but is completely marginalized in the art or was marginalized for a very long time in the art historical discourse. And now the adornment of the flower that you see in Olympia is actually also a reference to another painter, Frédéric Bazille, who also painted Laure and who was studying with Manet in his studio. So I think there's like so many different layers of correcting the art historical discourse in Mickalene Thomas' work that it is sometimes even like hard to unpack and to understand all these different references that she is using. And then of course the reference to blaxploitation comes in, and black female empowerment, etc. So this is another piece that was part of this show. And the last one I want to mention, which is very important in terms of styles, is someone like Mark Bradford, who was part of the first show, and here with his Enter and Exit, the New Negro, which consists of his like famous permanent wave hair and papers. No, how are they called? Like the paper that you put around the perm and the tips of your perm. I know you don't do, maybe you're going to do perms anytime soon again, but when you're getting a perm, you would have to cover your tips so that they don't break by the chemicals, and this is what he used as material for this painting, which is of course now a signature by him, but also through which you have a very different conversation around material and materiality. And I'm not going to talk about this piece, although I love it very much. Mark Bradford today or now is on view at the Venice Biennial, or that, yes, it's still on, I think, as the representative of the American Pavilion in Venice. So let me talk just a few minutes, because I know I've talked for a long time now, about the important shift that post-Black art has brought, or has come, or that is coming into being, still coming into being. So we have on the one hand many people who were going through the Studio Museum, who were became writers, etc. But there is something called African diaspora art history, which is actually still in the making, with someone like Krista Thompson or Huey Copeland, who actually also was an intern at the Studio Museum, and both of them teaching at Northwestern University. What I also have to emphasize is that, for instance, in 2006, So in between the shows, you had Kelly Jones, who is also a very important artist, African-American art historian, who also works on bringing this discipline into being, who was curating a show on abstraction, for instance. Or you have Valerie Castle-Oliver in Houston, who would then focus on Black conceptual artists with her show A Sidelong Glance. No, it's not A Sidelong Glance. I don't remember but it's at the Contemporary Art Museum, Houston. So something about consciousness, Valerie Castle-Oliver. So you have all of these shows appearing after 2001. And at the same time, Darby English asks us in his book, which name I forgot right now, How to See a Work of Art in Total Darkness. It is no less convincing than ever to speak of Black artists as if they share an enterprise. It recommends a turn toward the subjective demands that artists place on the multiple categories they occupy, and that we grant this multiplicity right of place in our methodologies. And I think that is the tricky, very, very tricky part, where many institutions, including art educating institutions, are failing, and failing in the sense of what I have here in a meme, that when I was teaching at an art school, very often my students, in Rotterdam, the students, not many students were Black because the school was predominantly white, but Rotterdam is a very diverse city. But they would come to me and then would get, asked like, oh, why are my teachers like not getting my point, or they say that I'm too opinionated. So actually what Darby English is asking us here is also a reflection on the self, a reflection on who are you as an educator, or who are you as an artist? What kind of responses are coming from you in relationship to the socio-historical moment in which we're in? And are they formed by your lived experience or not? It's a very difficult question. However, many of the students were coming with questions that I had during my education as well. So hence why I think it is important to quote Stuart Hall when he says talking about giving up power is radically different, and also power of definition, right? It's radically different experience from being silenced. The discourse, as I mentioned, has brought up the overlooked ones, Norman Lewis, Jack Whitten. I'm always so excited to see Jack Whitten's work, and then I cannot but throw shade at Gerhard Richter, because I'm always thinking, like, what would have happened if people would be aware of Jack Whitten when Gerhard Richter started to do very much the same thing, yeah? Now, Jack Whitten is already part of the Tate Modern Collection, etc., so he has his place, but nevertheless, I'm always flabbergasted. Barbara Chase-Ribou is another artist who was for a long time overlooked. Howardina Pindle is a very interesting person. She was also a curator at the MoMA. Very, very interesting history that we're looking at here, also in terms of like a discussion around materiality and what does that mean. Then you have here, that's the piece by Barbara Chase-Ribou in the background, but I really love this piece that was recently on show at the Brooklyn Museum by Elizabeth Cartlett, that could not speak louder to the current condition that is actually prevalent in the US. Or you have conceptual artists such as David Hammons, who was not overlooked, not at all. However, I just think that these pieces are extremely important. And I think also that the kind of commercial acknowledgement for abstraction is expressed in a show such as Blackness in Abstraction that was curated by Adrian Edwards for Pace Gallery. So now we're not talking about an institution institution. We're talking about a gallery that would take on this challenge. Another important shift, another person who was interning with the Studio Museum was actually Kimberly Drew, who founded the Black Contemporary Art Tumblr. And who does not know this Tumblr? Okay. You don't know? Okay. Check out this Tumblr because it has expanded. Yeah. So the discourse, the argument that I'm trying to make is that this very, very efficient PR campaign, and let's call it PR campaign around post-Black art, has a long, long reach. Here's again the show that I mentioned earlier, but that is not directly connected. But to slowly come to an end, the discourse is actually also arriving in Europe. A discourse that I think is still very, very, very tricky to grasp, because again, we are having the two-tiered system. We're having still the culturally specific shows, and then we have the universal shows. And here you see the example of the Musée Quai Branly, which I think is almost an affront, or let's say like an insult, because it is an ethnological museum that had this show on display, that only a few years earlier had a show called Noble Savage, yeah, where you would see people in photographs that would show the human zoo. And then you have this show, African American Artists and Segregation. So I'm like, whatever. But it's a French discourse, and it's very, very complicated. So then in also this year, and it's still on, you have Soul of a Nation, Art in the Age of Black Power, which in the UK has mixed reviews. Why do you think it has mixed reviews? It's very simple, because the UK, they have a black arts movement, a black British arts movement, but the first show that the Tate Modern would put on as a survey would be on African American art, which then creates is very much based on the model of scarcity. There is not enough exposure. And so on the one hand, it's amazing. It was a really beautiful show, and I have never seen many of those pieces before. However, what about an Isaac Julian? What about a Sonia Boyce, or other really important Black British artists who were working around the same time, and even modernist artists? So to wrap it up, and to use a little of my favorite meme, although I would actually make it end, yeah, so end. So, and this is where the link to the current moment of, I would call it like simply hopelessness, comes in when it comes to Black philosophical theory. Is that we cannot exit really this aporia. Structurally, it seems impossible, yeah, even though there are so many talented Black artists, talented writers, talented curators who are also now working in those major institutions. So Thomas Lux, who would be part of the curatorial team of the exhibition 4 and was already at the Studio Museum when Freestyle was launched, is now working in the performance art department at MoMA. Or you have someone like, her first name is Naima. She is now, what's her surname? Keith, thank you. Who's now working in San Francisco or Los Angeles in the African American, San Francisco? Los Angeles, thank you. Los Angeles, and leads a major art institution. Nevertheless, this kind of binary system that was established during the civil rights movement as really like an incompetence. And this is one of my main arguments. When it comes to art education, often when it comes to the curation of Black art, but also when it comes to institutional politics, is a sheer incompetence of doing the work of this kind of reflection that Romare burden demands of us. Yeah? And this is basically where I want to end. And I know that there most likely will be many, many questions, but I have spoken for a very long time.